Okay, let's talk about every book I read in 2025. The first one is A Moveable Feast by Ernest Hemingway. And in this book, Hemingway describes his days when he lived in Paris as a young, not yet established writer. And the book is a lot about his friendships with other writers like James Joyce and Scott Fitzgerald, and the way he describes them as young writers is just very delightful. The main point that Hemingway is trying to make in this book is that you're very lucky if you have gotten to live in Paris as a young person, because you get to take that feeling with you wherever you go afterwards. So I think the quote that most people know best from this novel is, "If you're lucky enough to have lived in Paris as a young man, then wherever you go for the rest of your life, it stays with you. For Paris is a movable feast." So yeah, that's where the title comes from. I liked about this novel, first of all, that I read it when I was on my way back home from Paris. So, it holds a special place in my heart for that. I also really liked how he talked about how impossible it seemed for him to ever write an entire book when he was young. He writes something like, "I can write one or two beautiful sentences, but I cannot even conceive of ever writing an entire novel." So there are a lot of writers' struggles in there. And I also really love the friendships he describes with other writers and how they always visit each other and support each other. Here's a quote from page 23. "I had learned already never to empty the well of my writing, but always to stop when there was still something there in the deep part of the well, and let it refill at night from the springs that fed it." Now, I will say this is a little bit episodic. There's, it reads more like a lot of vignettes, not really a story that hangs together. And though I see what people like about Hemingway, he'll never be my favorite author. His language is very sober, and I don't know, I'm just not aching to go out to buy another book of his. Oh, I'm not gonna hold this up. Next, the complete essays by the father of the personal essay, Michel de Montaigne. Montaigne wrote a total of 107 essays over the span of his life, and I haven't read every single one of them, but definitely most of them, and the most important ones, I would say. This is a splendid translation, by the way, very readable, by M.A. Screech. So what do I like about this? I think it's really special to be there when a genre is born. The personal essay in that way just didn't exist before Montaigne. And though it is philosophy, it's very readable. So I would recommend this to anyone who's trying to get into philosophy. And probably the biggest thing I like about these essays is, though they're very well written, they're imperfect. Essayer in French means to try, and I just feel like he stayed very true to that word in what he did. He's having thoughts, he's trying something out. He doesn't state it as truth or fact, or he doesn't polish it too much. It's a little bit the opposite of what we think of, when we had to write essays for school or something. And yeah, this volume definitely holds some of my favorite essays of all time. On 3 Kinds of Social Intercourse was probably my favorite essay of the year. I love it, and his writing, though this came out in 1588, part 2, I think, it just feels evergreen. The thoughts he has about society and friendship and politics and nature, it's a true classic. I'll read you a quote. Page 928 from on 3 kinds of social intercourse. The solitude which I advocate is, above all, nothing but the bringing of my emotions and thoughts back to myself, restricting and restraining not my wandering footsteps, but my anxiety and my desires, abandoning disquiet about external things, and fleeing like death from all slavery and obligation, and running away not so much from the throng of people as from the throng of affairs. Next we have Französische Literaturgeschichte by Jürgen Grimm and Susanne Hartwig, French, the history of French literature in English. I read this as preparation for my French literature course, which reminds me to say, by the way, I've created 2 online courses about literature this year. One about the history of French literature, another one that is called How to Read and Remember, Deep Reading in the Age of Distraction. So if you're interested in learning about literature in a deeper, more structured way, I do hope you check them out. I'll link them both. I'll link them both in the description box below. So this book is great for just opening on any page that you need when you need to read up on some French author. You know, those Metzler Literaturgeschichten, they're very well known, I feel like, in the German-speaking countries for doing thorough research and collaborating with amazing researchers to bring out these, I don't know, it's not an encyclopedia, I'm not sure what it's called in English. I think it's a Sammelband. But it's funny to read it actually front to back. I actually read it because I didn't want to miss anything for my French literature course. And it's just, again, thorough, reliable, great thing to look up anything about French literature. Next we have a contemporary Austrian novel called Die Wut, die bleibt by Mareike Fallwickl. I think this is not translated into English yet, but it would be called something like The Rage That Remains. You might know that one of my resolutions for this year has been to read more in German. And this is a very popular book at the moment. It's like everywhere when you go into bookstores, and I got it as a present for my birthday, I think a couple of years ago. And I have a couple of other Fallwickl books on my list, but this is definitely the one that is most well known. And it's about the lives of 3 women. One woman that kills herself on the first page. I feel like that's not much of a spoiler. And then the other 2 women are her daughter and her best friend. And the book is a little bit about how they deal with that loss, but it's a lot more about how they deal with their womanhood. So they discuss many of the common problems women have or thoughts that women have. You know, for example, they immediately feel very responsible for taking care of the children. They are taking on a lot of work. They feel the need to always be pretty. They don't feel strong enough. You know, it's like, I don't know, typical sentiments you might have felt as a woman. And I'll say this, she's a great storyteller. This is a very well written book. It really keeps you turning pages. But the way she approaches the subject of being a woman, you know, because this is essentially a very feminist piece of literature, I just feel like she paints with kind of broad strokes. It's really all about the women and how they're disadvantaged in a way, and there are like maybe 2 sentences in the book where the men in the story also have complex feelings. I feel like it's hinted at once or twice that the loss of his wife was also difficult for the father. But mostly the men in the book are just greedy and ungrateful. And I somehow have a bit of a low tolerance for that kind of literature. To me, it's always, like, I call it angry feminist in my mind. Because again, the women are talked about with so much grace, and she's doing it very well. As I said, I have felt some of those things they talk about in the book, but then that same grace is not extended to the men. It just feels like the author was very pissed off and then she wrote a book. And that's just not what I'm after in my literature. Like, the thing I like about reading literature is that I come away with feeling empathy for usually both sides if there is a conflict. I think that, defines a well-written book. Something like Frankenstein, I talked about yesterday with someone, and the great thing about that book is that you leave with so much empathy for the monster, but equally as much for Victor, for his creator. You feel for him, you feel bad for his kind of naivety and his drive. So anyways, in this book I just felt like maybe focusing on the grief of losing a mother and a friend would have been a better focus for the plot. But yeah, it is what it is. I'll read you a quote from page 25. So ist sie dann, die Frau, wenn sie Mutter wird. Und Sarah hätte nicht besser darstellen wollen, aber schlechter auch nicht. Hätte überhaupt nicht neben Helene stehen wollen, wie eine Auswahlmöglichkeit im Schaufenster. Entscheide dich, junger Mann. Nimmst du die unkomplizierte Kinderlose, deren biologische Uhr krachend laut tickt, oder die überlastete Mutter, die bei jedem Satz von ihren Kindern unterbrochen wird und dankbar wäre für deine Aufmerksamkeit? Was auch immer Leon hinterher über Helene gesagt hätte, es wäre falsch gewesen. Und was auch immer Helene hinterher über Leon gesagt hätte, es hätte gestimmt. Quickly about the other two books by Mareike Fallwickl. This is Dunkelgrün, fast schwarz. I feel like it would be translated into dark green, almost black. This book is really about what it's like to live with a narcissistic friend or partner. Again, very multi-perspectival. She's a great writer, this time without the angry feminist undertone. And just, I don't know, to me this is a quintessential summer read. It keeps you turning the pages. It's not too hard to stay engaged with. And it's also fun to read something that is contemporary and happening in Austria. I think Mareike Fallwickl is from Salzburg. Her novels play in Salzburg mostly. And that's just around the corner. That's kind of unusual for me. I mostly don't like reading contemporary novels because I don't want smartphones in my books and things like that. So, it was good. I don't think I would reread it. I also don't think I would necessarily recommend it to anyone. Maybe if you have a partner or a friend with narcissistic tendency, and if you're really caught in that situation, this could be an eye-opening read. And then the third book I read by her, I don't actually have it here. It's called Und alle so still, and all so still. And that book has a great premise. It's about what would happen if people would just stop working. She really shows people in horrendous working situations, like, those people that deliver meals on a bike, or people who work in slaughterhouses. There's also an influencer in the story who's, essentially selling her body. It really makes you realize that we're creating hell jobs for ourselves in this society. So it's very good to have a view into that. But then towards the middle of the book, she just kind of imagines everyone going on a strike. Not a strike, what is that in English? She just imagines everyone stops working, and then the angry feminist undertone comes in again. It's like suddenly all the women have to be in a house together, and the men are really angry at them and attacking them because the women don't make food for them anymore or something. And then it ends weirdly unsatisfying. The end is quite open, and I just feel like she could have made a stronger point with this novel if she wouldn't have kind of gotten really derailed and would have left it open. But she kind of does that with all her novels, and you know, there's something that is nice to a story leaving in an open way, but I just feel like there was potential for a lot more. Next we have Père Goriot, or Father Goriot, by Honoré de Balzac, translated by Krailsheimer. This is another book I read for my French literature course, and you know, most people would characterize Balzac's writing as realism. He's often named in the same breath as Gustave Flaubert. Realism tries to portray the world as it is, you know, objectively real, without fluff or supernatural elements. And the narrator in a realist story is not passing moral judgments and not making his or her own conclusions. But as I talked about in my French literature course, realism is really a matter of perspective. Because compared to Flaubert, Balzac is actually more of a romantic. But anyways, our main protagonist in the story, Father Goriot, gives everything to his family, to his daughters more specifically, and he doesn't get anything in return. So the daughters need money all the time, and at the same time they don't really want to visit their dad at all. And he, you know, just kind of lives a more poor life as the days go by. He ends up dying alone in the pension that he lived in at the end of the novel. So, you know, it's a very sad story. It feels very slice of life at the same time. Balzac's writing is very fresh, and yeah, that's the thing I remember. Like when I opened this book and I read the first pages, it just felt very fresh. Like his writing is extremely clear. He definitely deserves a spot as one of the titans of French literature, right? I think his unique achievement was that he really drew a wide picture of French society in the first half of the 19th century. So it's very interesting historically. I just think if you like Flaubert and if you're looking for something similar, you'll really enjoy reading Balzac, especially Father Goriot. Here's a quote from page 21. If the human heart finds time to rest as it scales the heights of love, it rarely pauses in its headlong slide into hatred. Next novel is Das größere Wunder by Thomas Glavinic. I don't think this is translated, so I'll keep it short. It would be The Greater Miracle. I didn't like this book. I stopped, I think, 3/4 of the way through. It's a story about a boy or a man named Jonas, and he seems quite restless. He's kind of doing all of these extreme sports like climbing Mount Everest, and he's just, you know, looking for meaning in life, but then he meets this girl and it changes everything. I don't know, it's just not my kind of book for some reason. It was a present from a dear friend and it's one of her favorite books, so I hope she's not watching this video. Moving on to a fantastic read though. This is On Inequality by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Gosh, there will be so much French literature in this video. This text came out in 1755 and was originally called Discourse sur Inequality, and it was Rousseau's answer to a contest in the newspaper. The newspaper asked for answers to the question of where inequality comes from. Rousseau then goes on to make his point, and he says that fundamentally all people are equal, but he thinks inequality has kind of developed historically, and that it had a lot to do with land ownership or the concept of ownership in general. He also says that inequality is simply a justification by the rich to legitimize the exploitation of the very poor. And I'll read you this very famous quote that I think sums up Rousseau's sentiment very well. This is on page 109. The first man who, having enclosed a piece of land, thought of saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. How many crimes, war, murders, how much misery and horror the human race would have been spared if someone had pulled up the stakes and filled in the ditch and cried out to his fellow man, "Beware of listening to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong to everyone and that the earth itself belongs to no one." I think this text is great. I've had a blast dissecting it for the course. Rousseau is not always easy to read, but I think here he really shines. I think this is an incredibly sound theory for where inequality comes from. And if you at all have a sense of justice or are interested in societal inequalities, I feel like this is a very foundational text. Oh yeah, and this is the Maurice Cranston translation, which I recommend. Next we have Three Tales by Gustave Flaubert, or Trois Contes in the original French. This is again a translation by Kreisheimer, which is great. This was again some last minute reading I did for my French literature course. I really wanted to have a robust understanding of Flaubert's literary works, and these are 3 short stories by him. The most well-known is A Simple Heart, Un Cœur Simple, and I will say I was a little bit let down by his short stories. It's not that they're not good, they just really pale in comparison to Madame Bovary. I think Flaubert was really one of those authors that have worked all their lives to create this one masterpiece, right? The pinnacle. And that is just Madame Bovary, and nothing will ever come close to that. So it feels more like training for Madame Bovary, what he does in these short stories. A Simple Heart is about a woman a kind of a naive woman who suffers a lot and never really questions anything. She never talks about her worries. She doesn't know that she's really heroic in the way she always keeps going. It really made me feel bad to read this story. You know what I mean? It made me think of, I don't know, the generation of my grandmother or something, where people who had so little just worked all day, every day, and then still misfortune strikes and they just have to keep going, and all they have is their religion and their very little life, and if they're lucky, a bit of family and hopefully bread to eat in the evening or something. I'll read you a part of the first page of A Simple Heart. For 100 francs a year, she did the cooking and the housework, sewing, washing, and ironing. She could bridle a horse, fatten up poultry, churn butter, and remained faithful to her mistress, who was not, however, a very likable person. She had married a handsome but impecunious young man who died at the beginning of 1809, leaving her with 2 very young children and heavy debts. Okay, definitely a bit of a shift of gears. This book is called Beyond Habits, and it's actually written by 2 very dear friends of mine. It's only out in German for now, unfortunately. it's only the title that is in English, but it's supposed to be the ultimate guide to personal development. They've really put everything that they know and have learned about living a holistic life into it. So, beyond habits, the title alludes to building a life that is not, built on habits in the traditional personal development way, but to really create a lifestyle that supports your development. So again, a holistic approach. Now, I've known them both for many years, and many of the concepts they talk about in this book, like spiral dynamics and shadow work and polarity management, life purpose work, they're all topics that we went through together. We've read the same books at the same time. So it feels very special in this way. Like, I'm very proud of them. I know how hard they have worked over such a long time to put this together. I think it was supposed to be the basis for an app, actually, but they've since abandoned that idea. There are a ton of exercises in there, so it's supposed to also be a workbook, and I just can't emphasize enough how it really covers every imaginable topic under the umbrella of personal development, communication, relationships, nutrition, you name it, it's in there. It's almost to a point where it's too much. That's also the feedback I gave to them, that I'm not sure who I would even give this book to, because it's just very dense and very advanced in a way. They did self-publish this book, so there are some formatting mistakes in there, and the language overall just leaves things to be desired. For me, I'm just very sensitive to the way things are written, but they know that, right? I've given them my extensive feedback. Moving on to Das Gemeindekind by Marie von Ebner-Eschenbach. This is The Child of the Parish in English, though I don't know if the translation is good. I only read it in German. Marie von Ebner-Eschenbach was an Austrian writer. This book came out in 1887. And it's about a child, Pavel, who loses his parents and is just very unlucky overall. You really see in this book how important community is when a child loses their parents, and how important community support is, right? There's like one teacher in there that really believes in Pavel, but other than that, he's really at the mercy of people taking him in, taking care of him, and a lot of people don't think well of that boy because his parents were criminals. He doesn't get the chances other children get, all because of things that are outside of his control, right? It's not his fault that his parents were criminals. So this book is really a call for education, emancipation, and equal rights. And it's painful because young Pavel really does what he can and he works very hard, but you see that some people's opinion of him will just never change. So it's a lot about gossip and community building, manipulation, guilt, responsibility, those kinds of topics. I know that the author really believed that without pedagogy, there's no hope for our society. I will say this is somehow such a strange book. I don't know what it is. It's like the way it is written, it just made me feel very uncomfortable, and I didn't necessarily like reading it. Here's a quote from page 123. Warum wart ihr so mit mir? Weil ich als Kind ein Dieb gewesen bin? Wie viele von euch sind denn ehrlich? Wenn mein Vater am Galgen gestorben ist, kann ich dafür? Bagage. And then later. Wenn ich aber heute etwas tue, was auch mich an den Galgen bringt, dann ist es eure Schuld. Next up we have Days of Reading by Marcel Proust, or Sur la lecture in the original French. This is a fantastic book to start with if you feel daunted by reading In Search of Lost Time by Proust. It is a short collection of essays exploring how Proust saw reading and writing. So it's a lot about his fondness for books, childhood memories of reading, and how he relates to characters. The essay Days of Reading is extremely beautiful, and if you're someone who, loves reading, this will really touch you. But then it's only a couple dozen pages, so again, it's very accessible. I think this makes a beautiful gift for any lover of literature. So a great introduction to Proust and how he thinks and how he writes. It definitely has the long Proust sentences in it, so if you like this book, you'll probably like In Search of Lost Time. And if you don't like it, you probably do not like reading In Search of Lost Time. So beautiful. This quote. Okay. Quote from page 70. We feel very strongly that our own wisdom begins where that of the author leaves off, and we would like him to provide us with answers when all he is able to do is provide us with desires. And he can only awaken these desires by making us contemplate the supreme beauty to which the utmost effect of his art have enabled him to attain. Next book, Wilhelm's Zimmer, or Wilhelm's Room by Tove Ditlevsen. Now, I don't know what it is with her, but I would consider Tove Ditlevsen to be one of my favorite authors. Her trilogy, Childhood, Youth, Dependency, is so good, and it has almost single-handedly got me back into reading. So I adore her autobiographical writing, but anytime I try to read one of her other novels, it's just not working. The magic just isn't there for me. I've had the same experience with Faces, Gesichter, her other novel. I've stopped them both halfway through because I just couldn't make myself go on. What's great about her writing is I think she feels very much like the Danish Sylvia Plath. You really feel mental illness seeping through the pages. It's very raw. But with this book, even though there are some good sentences in it, it feels too forced. It's trying to be artsy and experimental, but then it's a bit too much. Oh, I didn't even say what it was about. It's the story of a woman, Lisa Mundus, and she has just been abandoned by Wilhelm, her husband, for 20 years or something, and she really then starts spiraling into mental illness. But yeah, again, I stopped reading this halfway through. Where are you? Oh no. Okay, I've just spent way more time looking for Leutnant Gustl by Arthur Schnitzler than it would have taken me to review it. Oh my gosh, it's right here. What? Okay. Let's start again. Leutnant Gustl by Arthur Schnitzler. I cannot believe this. Arthur Schnitzler, definitely a candidate for a new favorite author. I don't think I can do this book justice in just a couple of minutes, but it is a novella that is entirely the inner monologue of a man, Lieutenant Gustl, and it is about his fears, his obsessions, his neuroses as a young lieutenant, as a young lieutenant. I don't even really want to go into what happens exactly, it really needs its own video, but essentially he fears that he might have to kill himself to defend his honor and reputation, which is ridiculous, of course, but really a testament to how hollow those codexes of honor are. There is a YouTube channel, I think his name is Kein und Abel. He has made a great video about this book. I'll link it in the description box below, so go watch that. He did a much better job at describing what this book is about, better than I can do here now, because I've kind of not made up my mind yet. This is a book I had to read for uni, and I didn't even really like it when I read it, but then it kind of stuck around in my head, and I don't know, the more time that has passed, the more I realized the genius in it. The stream of consciousness writing style is just so genius. There's no breaks really in this novel. He's constantly getting distracted and jumping around and contradicting himself. It really feels like someone has placed a camera in someone's mind. And Schnitzler really put everything that he knew about psychoanalysis into this novella. I believe he was even a psychoanalyst himself, who then pivoted into writing. And I know that the interpretation of dreams by Sigmund Freud was his inspiration to write this novella. So the language seems very colloquial, but it's actually worked on a lot to make it seem natural, if you know what I mean. Yeah, and we had to read it for uni because it was really the first great inner monologue in the history of German literature. It came out in 1900, and I'm just very eager to read Schnitzler's dream novella and just read, I don't know, everything else by Schnitzler. It's great. And very slim. I mean, that's like 35 pages or something. Okay, I just changed the battery of the camera and saw that I've been filming for an hour, and we are 1/3 of the way through, so I need to be a bit more concise. We're moving right along. Next book, Bonjour Tristesse by François Sagan. Mostly what I loved about this book is that I read it entirely in French. It was a real accomplishment for me, because I haven't ever before just read a book in French cover to cover without knowing upfront what it was about exactly, or without having upfront read it in German or in English. François Sagan was only 19 when this book came out, so it's a very tender and raw story of Cécile, who's a 17-year-old girl who spends the summer with her father on holidays. And there are two different women in her father's life, and you can tell that she's looking to them, assessing kind of through her teenage mind which one she would like to be when she grows up. So, you know, she's a little bit looking for guidance. Do I want to be more of a traditional or intellectual woman, or more a bit of a party woman or something? So there are definitely some interesting dynamics going on between her and her father and the women, and it escalates quite severely in the end. I'm not gonna spoil you. To me, this book always gives me Lolita vibes, though it is, you know, not that kind of relationship that they have, but the older man, younger girl dynamics, I don't know, it's just giving me that vibe. It's great. It really feels like a classic. See, I can do quick reviews. Okay, bird by bird. What's next? Period Power by Maisie Hill. Now, this is a book about cycle syncing. If you don't know what that is, just let me enlighten you quickly. So, cycle syncing refers to syncing up your menstrual cycle to your lifestyle, or rather, syncing up your lifestyle to your menstrual cycle. So, due to hormones changing so much throughout a month, women naturally have more or less energy at any given day of the month. And it's really handy to have an eye on that, and if you can, kind of adjust your life to it. So, you know, that you feel supported and not overwhelmed when you're planning an important meeting or a speech or something when you have your period. You're probably not going to be in the mood to do that on that day. So it's about learning to live with your energy, not against it, and to use the natural spikes of hormones to get things done. And I'm not really giving this topic enough depth here, like that's an entire rabbit hole one can get into. And I've known about this concept for a long time. I've been tracking my cycle and all of that good stuff. But it's been a long time that I've actually read a book about it. So when I saw this at Shakespeare & Co. in Paris, I was just really drawn to it. I just thought it looked beautiful. I was just like, I'm not going to do any research, I'm just going to give it a go. And I kind of regretted it. My huge issue with this book is, again, the angry feminist undertone. Maisie Hill just sounds very pissed off. And I mean, I get it, right? It's annoying that women don't learn about this stuff in school. And it's frustrating that our society is built in such a way where we have to perform equally every day. But we're learning about it now, right? And to me, when education of any kind has this resentful undertone, it just kind of ruins it for me. I'll read you a quote and I think you'll know what I mean. Okay, so this is page 13 about the clitoris. Densely packed with an astounding 8,000 nerve endings, that's double the amount of the male equivalent, the glans or head of the penis, your clitoris is all about pleasure. And then later on, but given the fact that the clitoris in its entirety is larger than an average flaccid penis, I prefer to think of the penis as a small clitoris. When I read that, all I could see in my mind's eye was like a kindergartner being like, oh, you say boys are cool? No, girls are much cooler. Or the grown-up version of that would be like, well, throughout history we thought men are much cooler, but turns out women are much cooler, you know? And I'm like, why are we doing this to each other? It's just, that's not what feminism is supposed to be in my mind. So I'll get off my soapbox now, but I just don't like pitting the sexes against each other and disguising it as information, or rather, you know, providing information and then sprinkling in kind of, I don't know, what to me are like really nasty blows at men. Like, why do we have to do that? Why can't we just talk about how to do it better? Suffice to say, I didn't really enjoy it. I read it because I wanted to prepare a presentation for my personal development group, and I just ended up actually watching some YouTube videos and doing some other kind of research, because this, I don't know, this was just not, that was not it for me. Now we're moving on to Die Weber by Gerhard Hauptmann. This is The Weavers in English, and Gerhard Hauptmann was a German dramatist who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And this was staged the first time in 1893 after quite an intense period of censorship. So that's 2 years after the play was first released. And the censorship was due to people being afraid that it would lead to uprisings when people read this play. So obviously I was very intrigued. This is a story about weavers who are concerned about the Industrial Revolution, and they, do an uprising in 1844. It's quite sad to read about that because, the weavers just get less and less money, they hunger, their children have to work. They're really feeling the squeeze of the Industrial Revolution. And I know that this play was heavily influenced by Émile Zola's Germinal, who is about an uprising by workers of a mine. It's written in Schlesian dialect, which is interesting, and it's good. It's very impactful. It's sad. It really shows the horrors of not having enough to eat. Like, not being able to feed your children must be just the worst feeling on the planet. But it is a play, so I think it is better watched on stage than read. I had a little bit of troubles keeping up with all the characters and what exactly is happening. Next one along, we have Simple Passion, or Passion Simple, by Annie Ernaux. This is a novella about a woman who starts an affair with a married man. And this was the 20th and last novel that I picked for the French literature course. So it has a special place in my heart for that. In my mind, a novella is really successful when it kind of comes in, and in the short period of time that you read it, it kind of stamps a certain experience in your mind, and then when the novella is over, the imprint still lasts. Like a novella is always very impactful and quick in that way. I think we learned, how did we learn it at uni? I think our teacher said that novellas are short, unconscionable or outrageous stories with universal validity, and because they don't have a lot of time to do like complex world building or really flesh out characters, they have to really pack a punch within just a few pages. So this is really, really well executed here, is what I'm trying to say. This is a good novella. Ernaux has such a Ernaux has such a clear and distinct voice. She has a quite a good talent of connecting the very personal with that which is universal, it seems. And I mean, she won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2022, so she probably is a good writer. It's a good, quick read. I remember just feeling really bad for that woman and how she was kind of building her entire day and life around this man that really isn't treating her so well and is married, but she's like staying home all day, cleaning up, making herself look pretty, just in case he might come over later. I'll read you a quote and I think you'll see what I mean. Page 14. If he told me he was arriving in an hour, an opportunity, in other words, an excuse to be late without arousing his wife's suspicions, I would enter a different phase of waiting, devoid of thought or even desire, to the extent of wondering whether I would be able to achieve an orgasm, bursting with frenzied energy, yet unable to organize the simplest tasks, having a shower, getting out the glasses, painting my nails, mopping the floor. I no longer knew who I was waiting for. I was entirely at the mercy of that crucial moment when I would hear the car brake, the door slam, and his footsteps on the concrete porch. A moment which I always anticipated with unspeakable terror. Next we have not actually a book that I have read, but that is a little bit of a representation of what I've read. This is Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer's Dialektik der Aufklärung, Dialectics of Enlightenment. Now again, I didn't read this book, but I have had a course about Adorno this year at university, and I read a lot of Adorno. So many of my reading hours were filled with his essays, and even though I decided not to include university reading, little essays and secondary literature and all that in this video, I've read so much Adorno that I feel like it warrants being in this video. I definitely still have to climb a few rungs in my ability to read philosophy to really give this book a try. What I can say about Adorno is that he's an extremely sophisticated thinker of the 20th century. He's also a social theorist, and he has put forth so many important concepts to understanding what has happened culturally and politically and with art in the 20th century. So I respect him a lot, but he's hard to get into, and I definitely appreciated the curation of essays that my professor gave us, because I would have been completely lost if you just gave me this book and I had to somehow get through it. Next book, Why We Sleep, Unlocking the Power of Sleep and Dreams by Matthew Walker. I listened to this in an audio book version. I think what happened this year is that I just got really fed up with my YouTube consumption of constantly having a video in the background while I was doing chores around the house. So I thought I'll try audiobooks, and I learned that it's not really good idea for me to read audiobooks. I mean to listen to audiobooks. Oh my gosh, I'm getting loopy. It's not a good idea for me to listen to literature in audiobook version. Like, those books are often those that I have to read for uni, or have to read them very attentively and I need to read with a pen. But self-help books are much easier to digest while I'm doing something else, and it kind of satiates that, that hunger for curiosity and for learning something about the world. And I can just listen to that while I'm cooking or working out. And that plan has worked out quite well, I would say, for me in 2025. And this was one of the first books that I listened to, because I've had it for a long time, but I've never been able to make my way through it just reading it. So this is a book about sleep, why it's important, the science behind it, what happens when you don't sleep, all of that stuff. It's full of studies that have been done about sleep, like so many studies to a point that it gets nauseating. Like every page there's a study of the University of has found that. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate the scientific rigor that Walker put into this book. He has created is really a one-stop shop for all things sleeping. And it is readable for the layman, but it's just a lot of information for the average reader that probably doesn't care about all that stuff. Here is a quote from page 79 about the amount of why babies need so much sleep, basically. Charged with such a Herculean task of neuroarchitecture establishing the neural highways and side streets that will engender thoughts, feelings, memories, decisions, and actions, it's no wonder REM sleep must dominate most, if not all, of early developmental life. In fact, this is true of all other mammals. The time of life when REM sleep is greatest is the same stage when the brain is undergoing the greatest construction. I'll be honest, I probably wouldn't have made it through this book if I had to read it and if I couldn't have just listened to it. And I think what most people are curious about is actually summarized in the appendix on 1.5 pages. The appendix is called Most Important Sleep Hygiene Tips, right? And then it's like, put your room to a bit of a colder temperature, go to sleep at the same time every night, but you have to make it through, 330 pages before you get to that. The upside is, if you read this book, it really makes you prioritize your sleep, right? It's just like affirming over and over again how important it is, but because it's so thorough, I feel like if sleep is not your number one concern in life right now, it's just a little bit much. But this book really kicked off my listening to audiobooks in the gym era. And here's the book that followed it. Stolen Focus by Johann Hari. Both of these books are read by the author, which I think gives it a really nice personal touch. And I mean, the subtitle says it all, Why You Can't Pay Attention. This is a book about our attention crisis. I would say this is the most important book I read in all of 2025. It's not the nicest book that I have read, but as a citizen alive in this time, it's just unavoidable to know about these things, it feels. And Hari really manages to weave together so many aspects of our loss of attention in this book, from the way our technology develops to the way we sleep, work, read, rest, all that. So it's just a very complete picture of a problem that concerns all of us. I think we all have a vague feeling that the world is speeding up and that we're being flooded with information and that we cannot pay attention the way we used to. And that in turn makes us feel more stressed and out of control. But it's really nice when someone comes along who is taking on years of research to actually find out where all this comes from, how severe it is, and what we can do about it. So I have a lot of respect for Hari's work. He's a great journalist. His books are written amazingly. I've also read Lost Connections, which is a book about depression many years ago, and I was equally impressed. So again, not a pretty book, but very important. And here we have Die Liebhaberinnen by Elfriede Jelinek, or Women as Lovers in the English translation. I historically didn't get along very well with Elfriede Jelinek. She won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2004, I believe, and she is one of the most important Austrian writers. So I always feel like I should read her, and I did read her a little bit, but I find her stuff just very unreadable, actually. I was so put off getting into her work. I feel terrible for saying that, but I was like, never again, I'm not touching another Elfriede Jelinek book. But then I had to read this for uni. And this book is about two women, Brigitte and Paula. And throughout the novel, you see them go from having dreams of the future to just becoming housewives, right? So they have all these big dreams, and then they end up just having a husband and children and cooking and sewing and all of that stuff all day. I will give it that. It's a lot more readable than the other things I've read by Jelinek, and it's funny because it's very overdone, right? It almost reads like satire, and I see what Jelinek was getting at. I think she wanted to show us in a very uncomfortable way that women just had such limited freedom just a few decades ago. I think Paula asks herself at the beginning, do I want to become a housewife or a sales assistant? Because those are really the only two options she has in her life. Here's a quote from page 15. So ist im Laufe der Jahre ein natürlicher Kreislauf zustande gekommen. Geburt und Einsteigen und geheiratet werden und wieder aussteigen und die Tochter kriegen, die Hausfrau oder Verkäuferin, meist Hausfrau, Tochter steigt ein, Mutter kratzt ab, Tochter wird geheiratet, steigt aus, springt ab vom Trittbrett, kriegt selber die nächste Tochter, der Konsumladen ist die Drehscheibe des natürlichen Kreislaufs der Natur, in seinem Obst und Gemüse spiegeln sich die Jahreszeiten, spiegelt sich das menschliche Leben in seinen vielen Ausdrucksformen, in seiner einzigen Auslagenscheibe spiegelt sich die aufmerksamen Gesichter seiner Verkäuferinnen, die hier zusammengekommen sind. So yeah, this has been written in connection with the women's movement that was happening in the 60s and 70s. And though I wouldn't say I really like the book, it has definitely softened my opinion on Jelinek. Though I doubt that she'll ever become one of my favorite authors. Okay, next is a book I didn't finish, which rarely happens. This is The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. I know Le Guin is well loved and apparently a very good writer. I'm just not really into science fiction. And I think it just has to do with the motifs of the genre. Just kind of always the same, you know, like you open a novel and then there's space travel and this encounter with a different species and this oppressive system somehow. I don't know, but I don't know what it is about those things, but it's just I open the page and I read that and I'm so bored. I'm like, oh my gosh, yawn. Why is it that again? So I just haven't had really good experiences with sci-fi or dystopian literature. I remember reading The Handmaid's Tale and I found it utterly disappointing. I was really annoyed. That was years ago, but I felt like there was so much build up and you really constantly feel like something important is gonna happen, but then nothing really happens. So I don't know, there's just like a barrier inside of me that I never really read, I guess, stories with fantastical elements. I think I'm learning about myself that I only like books when they have a plot that is somewhat realistic. So, you know, probably that's no fault of Ursula K. Le Guin. I heard she's fantastic and well loved by many, so I don't know, sorry. Next we have Der Ausflug der toten Mädchen by Anna Seghers. This is translated to The Dead Girls Class Trip, I believe. It's another one that I had to read for my History of German Literature course. This came out in 1944 and the narrator is a woman who has had to flee from Germany, from the Nazis, and she is in exile in Mexico. And after an accident she's very weak, and when she takes a walk, and I think she walks by a tree, it reminds her of a school trip that she took as a little girl back when she was in Germany on a ship on the Rhine. And so she remembers her girlfriends and classmates and how they were before the Nazi takeover. So when they were just children and they had no idea about politics yet. There is an innocence about these girls, right? And the way she remembers them. And then she also talks about what they turned into under the Nazi regime. So, you know, some ended up in concentration camps and others ended up marrying some high Nazi official or something. And that's the tension, like the uncomfortable feeling you get when reading it. is that she sort of tells you both timelines at the same time. Like she constantly jumps back and forth between how those girls mostly were when they were kids and then what they turned into. It's a heavily autobiographical story. Anna Segas, I know, really considered it her responsibility to write down what has happened during the war so that the following generations can read it. Here's a quote from page 15. Die älteste von uns allen, Lore, sie trug Rock und Bluse und rötliches, onduliertes Haar und hatte schon längst echte Liebschaften, war inzwischen von einem Tisch zum anderen gegangen, selbstgebackenen Kuchen zu verteilen. And then later, wie konnte es da mit ihr so ein finsteres Ende nehmen? Freiwilliges Sterben durch eine Röhre Schlafpulver. Ein verärgerter Nazi-Liebhaber hatte sie, da ihre Untreue Rassenschande hieß, mit Konzentrationslager bedroht. The next 3 books I read as preparation and research for my How to Read and Remember course. And the first one is Building a Second Brain by Tiago Forte. This is a book about organizing knowledge, basically. So, we're all bombarded with information all day, every day, and the question quickly becomes, what is worth writing down, what's worth keeping, and how do we turn those notes into projects that help further our, creative pursuits, and how do we turn these notes into projects? Say you're a writer, for example, and you have an interesting conversation with someone at a cafe, and it makes you think of something you could put into your novel. Like, how do you write it down? Do you write it on a piece of paper or in your phone? And when do you revisit it? And how do you actually add it into your novel? And how do these notes not spiral out of control so you just feel overwhelmed every time you want to keep writing on your novel, right? It's about those kinds of questions of dealing with lots of information in the time we live in. And Tiago Forte's suggestion is that you need something like a second brain, which is just a structure that supports your workflow and where you can deposit information into it in a way that's easy to find later and where you're not getting overwhelmed. So he offers a system for capturing, organizing, and revisiting knowledge. And it's really great. I really enjoyed this book. I already have a system that works quite well, but I've definitely tweaked it a little bit after reading this. And I just think this is really relevant for knowledge workers of any kind. Here's a quote from page 89. One of the biggest temptations with organizing is to get too perfectionistic, treating the process of organizing as an end in itself. There is something inherently satisfying about order, and it's easy to stop there instead of going on to develop and share our knowledge. We need to always be wary of accumulating so much information that we spend all our time managing it, instead of putting it to use in the outside world. Next we have How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles van Doren. This is the classic foundational text on deep reading. It really feels, like a classic at this point. I don't know how to explain it. Feels like you're sitting in front of an old, slow talking but very experienced professor that tells you all about the nitty-gritty of reading well. So, this book can be a little bit dense, but I feel like it's really worth it. They outline the different levels of reading, from basic comprehension to syntopical reading, where you connect ideas across different books. And there are a bunch of chapters also on how to read different kinds of books. So how to read philosophy, how to read history, how to read imaginative literature. I feel like anyone who has ever thought about how one should read a book still turns to this. So there is a reason for that, right? It's very thorough. Here's a quote from page 212. A work of fine art is fine, not because it is refined or finished, but because it is an end. Finis, Latin, means end in itself. It does not move toward some result beyond itself. It is, as Emerson said of beauty, its own excuse for being. And that is in the chapter Suggestions for Reading Stories, Plays and Poems. And here we have Thomas C. Foster's How to Read Literature Like a Professor. This is another guide for reading that I think is really approachable and almost playful. Foster talks about the hidden patterns in literature, the tropes, the structures, the symbols that are used often, and I think it's really helpful if you want to go from surface level reading to really analyzing books. Now, I don't agree with everything he says in here, but I think it's a good book to kind of get your mind jogging. You might start seeing connections that you otherwise miss, which is, that's the whole point of analyzing books. What I don't like about this book is that it's very unstructured. It's just chapter after chapter of Foster kind of musing on a theme in literature. It's like you're listening to someone talk who knows a lot about literature, but it's not really systemic. That's the one drawback, I would say. Okay, here we have Der Tod in Venedig by Thomas Mann, Death in Venice in the English translation. This is a novella about a man called Herr Aschenbach, who is, I think, somewhere in his 50s or something, and he travels to Italy to reflect on his life. And the book is, the novella is a lot about the identity problems of artists. But when he's in Italy, he actually falls in love with a teenage boy. Now, I'm unsure about the age of, him and that boy, but it's definitely inappropriate. Aschenbach tries to hide his fascination for the boy, but that really doesn't work so well. And when he tries to travel back home, he gets stuck in Italy. He has to go back to that hotel where that teenage boy was, which really made me laugh because I feel like that's one of Thomas Mann's favorite plot structures or something, like someone going on vacation somewhere and then getting stuck there and not being able to go back home. That's exactly what happens in The Magic Mountain as well. So it seems like the Venn diagram of Thomas Mann's writing is like getting stuck somewhere and not being able to go back home, plus falling in love with two young boys, and then also some weird sicknesses somewhere in the mix or something. I know this book caused quite a marriage crisis between Thomas Mann and Katja Mann when it came out, because the main protagonist has so many similarities with Thomas Mann. What else do I know? I think it's built like a Greek tragedy, which I will not get into now, but I didn't love this book. It was fine, but I just feel like if you're getting into Thomas Mann, this book doesn't really show you what he's capable of, and he's capable of so much, and I really want to read all of Thomas Mann. It's just, not as strong, I think. And next we have my baby, my child that I birthed from my actual womb. I love this book so much. Umberto Eco, The Name of the Rose. I had to deep read it for university this year because I wrote quite an extensive essay on it and I loved every second of it. I've also made an entire video about everything I know about this book, so I'll link that. Definitely watch it if you're an Umberto Eco fan, if you want to read this book. It's a 1327 murder mystery that is set in an Italian abbey, and yeah, just one of the most sold books in world literature. And for me, it's just, reading this, it's like, oh, that's how I would like to be able to write and think. I just have a lot of respect for Umberto Eco as a scholar, and it's just all the things he knows went into this book, it seems. There's so much symbolism and literary illusions. It's just, I really love it. The language is so beautiful in the translation already. Let me check. Yeah, it's translated by William Weaver, so I cannot even imagine how beautiful it must be in the original Italian. And this book almost single-handedly makes me want to learn Italian so that I can read it one day. Here's a quote from page 35. "For architecture, among all the arts, is the one that most boldly tries to reproduce in its rhythm the order of the universe, which the ancients called cosmos, that is to say ornate, since it is like a great animal on whom there shine the perfection and the proportion of all its members. And praised be our Creator, who has decreed all things in their number, weight, and measure." Next we have Hero Square by Thomas Bernhard. I feel immediate exhaustion just looking at a book by Thomas Bernhard. I don't know what it is. I had to reread this play, it's a play, for my History of German Literature course. The Hero Square is the square in Vienna where Adolf Hitler was greeted in March of 1938 by the Austrians. And Bernhard imagines a family that, years later lives in Vienna, and the wife still hears the screams on the Hero Square where people greeted Hitler. And Bernhard's point is, or always seemed to be, that there are just as many Nazis in Austria now as there were back then, and that times haven't really changed. And it's heavy, it's about trauma, it's just uncomfortable to read. It's not my favorite play, but it's very important, and I feel a little bit the same way as I feel about Elfriede Jelinek. Maybe they're just kind of hitting too close to home or something. That could well be. Both Jelinek and Bernhard, they're really trying to expose some ugly truths about Austrian society, but it's also just so exhausting to engage with that all the time. I think that's why I'm kind of a little bit, just feeling nauseous thinking about them. What a great review. Okay. Next we have, where are you? Ilse Aichinger, Die größere Hoffnung, The Greater Hope, it would be translated to in English. In this book, Ilse Aichinger works through her experience under the Nazi regime as a young Jewish girl, and it's really heartbreaking. This is a beautiful and very heartbreaking book about the naivety of a child that doesn't know what's going on, not knowing why her family is being torn apart, why she cannot play with certain children. It's a tough read to look at that time in history through the eyes of a child. It's very well done. The language is beautiful. Okay, 10 to go. I think we're gonna make it before the sun goes down. Flight Without End by Josef Roth, Die Flucht ohne Ende in German. I didn't like this book, so I can barely remember anything. It's about a man who is held captive after the war or during the war, and then he flees and he wants to come back home to Vienna, I think, but then on the way he gets captured again and falls in love with this other woman who kind of politically influences him, and then when he finally does get to Vienna, his wife has already gone to Paris or something, and he just never quite finds home again after the war. So it's about the loss of orientation that people feel when they're coming home from the war. And it's a very important piece of literature for the time between the two world wars. But I don't know, I didn't enjoy it. What can I say? This, on the other hand, is a great book, Märchen, Mythen, Träume by Erich Fromm. Eine Einführung in das Verständnis einer vergessenen Sprache. So I looked it up. The English translation is The Forgotten Language, an introduction to the understanding of dreams, fairy tales, and myths. And I feel like that subtitle already tells you everything. Dreams and myths are a language, a way in which we understand the world, but we have somehow collectively unlearned how to speak it. That's, I would say, the main point of this book. And Erich Fromm really weaves in a lot about the history of the interpretation of dreams, for example, his own dream theories, psychoanalytic concepts. He discusses some literary works as well in there, like Kafka and different myths. So, it's a good book to kind of start connecting with that language again and how that language can really help us. So it's a very beautiful read. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. Wow, this might earn the prize for the strangest book I've read this year. This is Publikumsbeschimpfungen by Père Handke, Offending the Audience in English. And that already says it all. It's a theater play where actors only speak directly to the audience and offend them. So, they say like, oh, you wanted to go see a play, you have expectations, but you're not gonna see anything that you haven't seen before. It's just, I think they call it an anti-play, because it really renounces theater as a whole. And I think in a 1970 interview, Handke said that his idea behind this play was making people aware of the world of theater, not of the outside world. So, it really fits into that postmodern kind of time. It's something someone would do with a theater play one day. There's a great staging of this on YouTube. I'll link it, so if you speak German, you can listen to that. I mean, there's something delightful about it, I gotta say. It's well done, but it's just, a postmodern kind of experiment. I just don't take that much away from a play like this, but I do respect it as a piece of art. Next up, we have How Fascism Works by Jason Stanley. A very important and bold book to write and to read in this time that we're living in. Stanley talks about the rhetoric that fascist leaders use, that they always divide the population into us and them. And Jason Stanley was quite big in the news this year because he is a professor at, what was it, Yale? I'm not sure, but an important American university, and he left America because he warned that, they're drowning in fascism, and because of his heritage, he's afraid, and he fled to Canada, I think. Now, I got really sucked into the news for the first time in my life after Trump's election last year, and I felt a little bit, out of control with the whole situation, and I thought, you know what, I'll buy this book and I'll read this book, because that's a lot more productive than kind of keeping up with the news cycle all the time. And I did, and it really worked. I've kind of, stopped watching the news again. And so it felt equally kind of productive and great to learn about fascism just in an abstract way, but also so chilling to read it again in the time we're living in. It's very reader friendly, so even if you don't know a lot about history, he explains everything really well. And just reading the table of contents, he talks about the mythic past, propaganda, anti-intellectualism, hierarchy, victimhood, sexual anxiety, and how all of that gets instrumentalized by fascist leaders. Purple Cow by Seth Godin is a marketing book. He talks about the fact that if you're trying to sell any product or service nowadays in the post-TV world, it has to be extremely unique, outstanding, and extraordinary, like as outstanding and extraordinary as a purple cow would be, because there are so many brown cows, but if there will be a purple one, people would talk about it all the time. They would tell all of their friends, and that's his theory of what your product should be. It's fine. I've read a few of Seth Godin's books. He has good inputs on marketing, I guess. It just feels a little dated somehow. It feels very 2015. And I do feel like the rules of marketing are changing again in the age of AI and overconsumption and everything that we're in. But it's a good book to get your mind jogging, to think outside the box, right? To not just copy someone, but to think of really an extraordinary product. Okay, now we're really getting to the books that I've read very recently. Mephisto by Klaus Mann. This is maybe the book I looked most forward to reading this year. Klaus Mann is Thomas Mann's son, and this book is about the life of an actor, Hendrik Höfgen. And that Hendrik Höfgen character is based on Gustav Gründgens, who is an actual actor that actually, acted during the Nazi regime, and Klaus Mann knew him very well. They were very close, but he ended up kind of abandoning his conscience and adapted to the Nazi regime to keep his job and improve his social status. Now, that is such an enticing plot. I've known about this book for such a long time. Like, oh my gosh, I want to read it. It's so exciting that Klaus Mann knew him personally, and what a kind of scandalous story. But I was a little underwhelmed with the way it was executed. And I think that just has to do with my expectations that I had when I went into the book. I just had very high hopes. To me, there's just too much kind of build up and fluff. And there's one chapter somewhere somewhere in the middle of the book, where we really get this inner monologue of Hendrik Höfgen, where you see him struggling with his decisions. Like he just doesn't know what to do to keep his jobs but also stay true to his friends, and it's like, I wish there would have been more of that, like that internal view. Yeah, but that was only a very short part of the novel. This book has an intense censorship story. Like, it was forbidden to be printed in Germany for decades, basically. And it's just hard to see the story only for what it is without all that historical baggage around it. You know, so there's the censorship part, and then the fact that it's a real story to an extent, and then that it's also Thomas Mann's son. So there are just a lot of things that make it hard to, I don't know, to just see the book for what it is. And I think purely for the writing, I just wasn't very impressed. I mean, he's a fine writer, but like not really outstanding to me. It was just overall a bit less impressive than I had hoped. Moving on to Die Macht der Fantasie, The Power of Fantasy by Ernesto Grassi. I'm reading this because a professor of mine mentioned it. It talks about how over the course of human history, we kind of value metaphorical language less and less. So symbolic language had to step aside and give way to literal language, right? Which means words that have an exact meaning, like in a dictionary sense. And Grassi really advocates for metaphorical language. He says that the real questions of humanity, the big questions that concern us, can only be explored through metaphors, and that's great. I can get behind that, right? If there's one thing I love in this life, it's metaphorical language. This book really makes me want to read more literary theory. I don't think it was ever translated into English, though, and I don't even think it gets printed anymore. I had to get it secondhand, so not very available, it seems. And then we have Die Atemschaukel by Herta Müller, The Hunger Angel in English, which Herta Müller wrote together with a man who has spent his youth in a concentration camp. And that is also the story of this book. That is awful enough as it is, but then there's also these descriptions of hunger in there that really, I don't know, it just turned my stomach upside down, literally. Like this book, it broke me in a way. Like, I remember having to read it for my German literature course, and it was quite a busy time of the year. I just kind of needed to get through it before the exam, and I really kind of decided to put up an inner wall to not let it get too close to me, because I didn't have time to be that affected by it. But it really is, I don't even know how to describe it. It's mostly the hunger bit. Like, they get a piece of bread every day and like a small portion of soup. And I'll read you a quote where they kind of switch out the bread. You know, they all get a piece of bread, and then the piece that the other person has always looks bigger. So they're like, do you want to switch your piece of bread with me? And then they switch, and then when they have the new piece, they suddenly feel like, no, my old one would have been bigger. It's like, oh my gosh, I don't know, I can't talk about it. I'll read you a bit from that scene. Vor dem Tausch kommt ein schleudernder Moment ins Hirn und nach dem Tausch sofort ein zweifelnder. Nach dem Tausch In der Hand des anderen ist mein weggegebenes Brot größer, als es in meiner Hand war. Und was ich bekommen habe, ist in meiner Hand geschrumpft. Man wechselt von einer optischen Täuschung zur anderen. Danach ist man immer noch betrogen, aber müde. Herta Müller is a very well-loved writer. I think she's Austrian-Romanian, if I remember correctly. And yeah, she really also builds her own vocabulary throughout the novel. It's very interesting. Like the hunger angel is one of those motifs, I guess, that comes back again and again. It's just terrible. Like when that boy gets out in the end, because he does survive, then also no one cares about him. It's like I've just really had it with books about the war for a while. Like it really confirmed my suspicion that in the German language, or maybe in Austria specifically or something, we're just still working through the war. Like there's so many books I've just shown you that I had to read for my History of German Literature course, right? And this was the last one. So this was a contemporary novel. I think this came out in 2012 or something. And I was like, okay, well, maybe at least the 2012 novel doesn't have to be about the war. And then it's still about the war and still about working through the war. So, you know, there's just such a heavy trauma there. Sorry, I think the book is from 2009. Okay. Moving on. Oh my gosh, this is such an emotional roller coaster. Okay. Dracula. This is such a great book. So I'm getting my spirits back talking about this. I don't know what to say. I just loved it. It's been a long time that I felt all giddy about a book, and I really do about this one. I know I've been talking a big game about how I don't like stories that can't be realistic, but this one just does it so well. I mean, I think everyone knows the story of Court Dracula and how he comes to England and things like that. I read it in October. I thought I would for Halloween. I needed a bit of a page turner because I was just going through a phase of like digital detox and not watching any YouTube videos. So I needed something that kind of entertained me, and it really did. I was so into it immediately. It's just, I've sat on the couch and audibly gasped at several points during this novel. I was like, oh my gosh, what he just kind of leaps towards you and bites you in the neck, like tries to bite you in the neck. That's really crazy. And it's just, I don't know, I've been kind of like clutching my pearls reading this book. I feel like a child talking about it. The concept really intrigues me as well. It's a collection of diary entries and newspaper articles where you never quite know what happened, and you kind of have to piece the story together for a long while. And yeah, I guess the last thing I'll say is that this book is a lot bigger than I thought. You know, I thought I would read it over a weekend, but then it took me like so many weeks to get through it. It's almost 500 pages, and I don't know why, but I somehow didn't expect that. Here's a quote from page 215. I have tried to keep an open mind, but it is not the ordinary things of life that could close it, but the strange things, the extraordinary things, the things that make one doubt if they be mad or sane. Okay, next up, Swan's Way by Marcel Proust, or Du côté de chez Swann in the original French. I have read this book before, but this is the first time that I've read it front to back in French. Yay! As many of you know, I'm currently following a seminar about Proust at university, and the prof said that we should ideally read it in the original French or in the German translation by Reichel Mertens, I think. that is worked over by Louise Keller. Now, I don't have that German version, so I thought, whatever, LFG, let's try it in French, and it went surprisingly well. I mean, it did take me such a long time to get through it. It was exhausting, definitely, but I know the book already, so I knew more or less what was happening, which made it a lot easier. And what can I say? It's my favorite book of all time. In the original French, so my heart definitely dropped several times, almost on every page, by just the beauty of Proust's observations and his metaphors, his sentences, just so good. I don't know yet if I'll keep going. I mean, I have to keep going for the seminar. I have to start part 2 quite urgently, actually. But I don't know whether I'll keep going in French or maybe read it first in English or maybe in the German translation. My reading of Proust is such a Frankenstein experience. It's very frustrating. And time-consuming. We'll see how far I go. I'm not having my mind set 100% on kind of reading it through now at this time of my life, because reading all of Proust, even though he's my favorite author and I would love it so much, it's just so time and energy consuming. And I just have a lot of other reading to do, a lot to read for uni. So I don't know if I can forego all of those things just to read Proust. But, the most beautiful and fulfilling reading experience of my year, that's for sure, with this book. Next we have How One Should Read a Book by Virginia Woolf. This is a very short, very readable essay that was originally a speech that Woolf gave to schoolgirls in 1926 about how one should read a book. Let me read you a quote from page 9. Yet few people ask from books what books can give us. Most commonly we come to books with blurred and divided minds, asking of fiction that it shall be true, of poetry that it shall be false, of biography that it shall be flattering, of history that it shall enforce our own prejudices. If we could banish all such preconceptions when we read, that would be an admirable beginning. She says, amongst other things in this essay, that we need a fine perception and a boldness of imagination to read well. And overall, the message just seems to be that reading is an active act, and that when we bring our own questions to the text, it can really exercise our creative powers. I think she says at one point, we are at once actors and spectators when we're reading. I found that sentiment quite beautiful. And yeah, Virginia Woolf is just such a luminous essayist. There's so much clarity in how she writes, and I always feel like when I'm reading her essays, it's like I'm catapulted into a still glass room outside of time or something. It's very clear in there, and her words are just clear as bells. So, and she says in this very essay that fiction, through a greater abstractness, delivers a purer truth. And I think that perfectly describes Virginia Woolf's own writing. She ends with a point that I've also made in my How to Read course, that books can only help us when we come to them laden with questions. So yeah, thoroughly enjoyed this. I think this would make a beautiful little gift for any friend that likes reading. You really can't go wrong with that. Okay, last book I actually read and finished in 2025, Theogony by Hesiod. So Hesiod is possibly the oldest Greek poet we know. He lived in the 8th century before Christ. And his writings were as influential to antique thought as were the writings of Homer. We just read him a lot less today. I'm reading this because of my philosophy course, where the main question is the cosmology in antiquity. So, how did people perceive the world? What did they think where the cosmos came from? All of that. And Hesiod puts forth his idea on the genealogy of the gods in this work. So, which ones came first and what did it all evolve out of? And he says that everything arose from chaos. It's very interesting to get an idea of what was such an early worldview, and it really makes you realize that what we have today is also just that, like it's one view of the world. So it's cool for that, but it's hard to read, I find, if you don't know anything about antiquity, because it's very short, but there's more than 300 different gods named in there. And I don't really have enough context to appreciate it, It's not a beginner's work, I feel like. I mean, let me read you a quote and you'll know what I mean. Oh, and this is the translation by M.L. West, by the way. Okay, here we go. Page 31. Fair-ankled Alcmene's valiant son, the mighty Heracles, after completing his oppressive ordeals, made Hebe his modest wife in snowy Olympus, child of Zeus and gold-sandaled Hera. Fortunate Heracles, who performed a great feat among the immortals, and now lives free from trouble, free from old age, for all time. For all time. I love the fair-ankled Alcmene. That would be me. My ankles definitely don't get a lot of sun these days. Okay, and then the last little category I have are books that I'm still reading. So current reads. The first one is Erland Loe's Naïf Super in Norwegian. Have to read it for my Norwegian course. I don't have it I don't have a physical copy, but it's an accomplishment that I can read in Norwegian a little bit, and we have a professor coming our way next week actually to talk to us about the book, a professor from Norway. Really cool. I don't love the book though, it's kind of annoying, but it's easy to read and it has somewhat short chapters, so that's good. Then I'm also currently listening to The Infinite Game by Simon Sinek. He talks about in this book that there are two kinds of games one can play, finite and infinite games. Finite games have the objective to be won, the players are known, the rules are fixed, and the outcome is always that there's a winner and a loser, right? Like something like football or a board game is a finite game. And then infinite games are more about keeping the play alive and perpetuating the game. There are known and unknown players. The rules are changeable, and the outcome is that there are no winners or losers, only players that are ahead or behind. And he says that most domains of life, like business and marriage and friendship, they're infinite games, right? You don't play them to get to a certain point. You play them to be in the game. And that nowadays we have more and more the mindset of kind of pushing for a certain goal, and it just doesn't work so well. I mean, that's what I think it is. I'm like 20 pages in. I think it's a helpful life philosophy. And then, as I already said, I'm gonna have to start reading part 2 of In Search of Lost Time by Proust, À l'ombre des jeunes filles en fleurs, in the shadow of young girls in flower, or within a budding grove, depending on the translation. And then I'm also gonna read very soon, I think this year still, Arthur Schnitzler's Dream novella. So I bought it. It has illustrations of Egon Schiele in it. I'm very much looking forward to that. And then this last little stack I just put here because they're kind of half reads for me. So there is let me show you. This is a poetry collection of favorites from British and American poetry. Now I didn't read this front to back, but I open it frequently to read a poem or two. So, you know, doesn't really, I don't know, does it count as read? I don't know. And then there's a bunch of books I read for my French literature course that I just cannot remember if I've finished them this year or last year already. We have The Misanthrope by Molière and The Flowers of Evil by Charles Baudelaire. Here in French, this is the English version. No, that's the bilingual text. So I think in preparation for the course, I also read some of that. Yeah, this is again Proust. I don't know why I have it here in English. And this, I'm also not sure whether I finished it this year. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? I have the same problem with this as with all sci-fi books so far. I just don't really like the world it plays in. I found this kind of exhausting to read as well. Had to read it for uni last year when I was in Paris, and then the teacher took it off the curriculum last minute when I had already made it halfway through, so I was very annoyed about that. So, thank you for being with me as I moved this stack from left to right. If you are enjoying these videos, please consider supporting the channel financially. I'll leave my Ko-fi account in the description box below, and thank you so much for being here with me and letting me talk about the books I read and enjoyed and didn't enjoy this year. I'll see you again very soon. Bye bye.